Welcome back, and before you spend another quarter, you might want to take a closer look, because some of the most overlooked Washington quarters in circulation are quietly turning heads in the collector world, and the one we're examining today might be hiding something far more interesting than its face value suggests. First coin. This is a 1977 D Washington quarter, and before you dismiss it as pocket change or toss it into a jar with 100 others, you need to slow down and really look at what you might be holding, because this particular coin from this particular year and this particular mint has a story buried inside it that most people walk right past every single day without ever knowing. The Denver Mint was running at full steam in 1977, striking hundreds of millions of quarters to keep up with the demands of everyday commerce in post-Vietnam, mid-stagflation America, a country that was tired, economically bruised, and moving fast, which means quality control was stretched thin, and the conditions were absolutely ripe for something unusual to slip through the doors of the Federal Reserve and land quietly in someone's change. The 1977 D had a total mintage of approximately 256,524,978 coins, a number so staggering it sounds like it guarantees worthlessness. But here's what the casual observer never understands. High mintage protects the common, but it never protects the exceptional, and within that ocean of ordinary quarters, a handful of coins emerged from the dies with characteristics that set them so far apart from the rest that seasoned numismatists stop mid-sentence when they encounter one. George Washington's portrait on the obverse was designed by John Flanagan, based on a famous 1785 bust by sculptor Jean Antin Houdon, and by 1977, those working dies had been through enough production cycles that the details of Washington's hair above his ear, the sharp definition of his jaw, and the crispness of the legend "In God We Trust" could vary in ways that sound minor until you understand what minor means in a high-stakes collector market. The reverse carries the heraldic eagle clutching arrows and an olive branch, with United States of America arcing across the top and $quarter along the bottom, and the way those letters strike into the metal, the depth of the eagle's feathers, the sharpness of the shield on its chest. All of these details become a fingerprint that separates a coin worth face value from one worth a conversation with a professional grader. What collectors hunt specifically in the 1977 D is the strike quality, because Denver in that era was known for occasionally producing coins with slightly weak centers, and paradoxically, finding a 1977 D with a fully struck, razor-sharp center, every feather defined, every hair strand on Washington's head distinct and bold, is rarer than most people sitting at home reading about coins would ever believe. Now here is where the history gets genuinely interesting, because 1977 sits in a transitional moment for American coinage that most people completely forget. The United States had already moved away from silver in 1965, so by 1977, the quarter was fully clad, a copper core sandwiched between two layers of copper-nickel alloy, and that construction matters enormously when you start examining coins for errors and varieties. The clad layer separation error, where the outer nickel layer partially or fully separates from the copper core during the minting process, is one of the most visually dramatic errors you can find on a 1977 D quarter, and when it happens cleanly and completely, the coin looks almost wounded, like something peeled away from it that was never supposed to leave. Beyond that, die cracks running through the lettering, off-center strikes where Washington's portrait drifts toward one edge of the planchet while the rim disappears on the opposite side, and doubled die obverse errors where the letters or numbers appear slightly ghosted or shadowed. These are the discoveries that change the trajectory of a coin's value overnight, and they were all physically possible coming out of Denver in 1977. The doubled die obverse on certain 1977 D quarters is perhaps the most sought-after variety in the entire series for this date. And if you are not familiar with what doubling looks like, here is exactly how to find it without any special equipment beyond a decent loupe or magnifying glass. Look at the date, the 1977, and examine each digit individually in raking light, which means you tilt the coin so light crosses it at a low angle rather than shining straight down on it. If you see a shadow, a shelf, a ghost of the same number sitting just slightly offset from the primary strike, you are potentially looking at a working die that was hubbed twice at slightly different angles during its creation at the mint, and that mechanical accident transferred itself to every single coin that die produced before it was pulled from service. The letters in Liberty, above Washington's head, are another hotspot. Look for a slight doubling in the serifs of the letters, that delicate finishing stroke at the end of each character, and if those serifs appear doubled or notched when they should be clean and singular, your heart rate is allowed to go up a little, because you may be holding something that a lot of people have been quietly searching for. When you pick up a 1977 D quarter to examine it seriously, the very first thing you do before anything else is weigh it, because a genuine clad quarter from this era should weigh 5.67 grams on a precise digital scale, and any significant deviation from that number tells you something important is happening with the metal composition or the planchet itself. A coin that weighs notably less might have suffered a clad layer error or was struck on a wrong planchet entirely, and wrong planchet errors, where a quarter die accidentally strikes a dime planchet or a foreign coin blank, are the kinds of errors that send collectors into an absolute frenzy because they are so visually dramatic and so undeniably official, bearing the full authority of the United States Mint on a body that was never supposed to receive it. Next, look at the rim under magnification. A properly struck 1977 D should have a sharp, even rim that rises consistently around the entire circumference of the coin, and any area where that rim is weak, missing, or dramatically thinner than the rest suggests either a die misalignment or a planchet that was not seated correctly in the collar during the strike. These physical characteristics are your roadmap, and following them carefully is what separates the people who find extraordinary things from the people who spend their lives walking past them. Here is the part of the conversation that tends to make people sit down, because when you start talking about what a problem-free, certified, exceptional 1977 D Washington quarter can bring at auction or in a private collector transaction, the numbers have a way of rearranging your whole understanding of what's sitting in your change dish. A minor die variety or subtle doubling on a mid-grade example might realistically bring somewhere between $2,500 and $3,500 among specialized variety collectors, which is already enough to reframe how you look at that dusty jar of quarters on your dresser. A more clearly documented and visually striking doubled die example certified by PCGS or NGC in a higher grade climbs toward $5,000, and at that point you are talking about a coin that costs as much as several months of car payments or a portion of a home renovation that you've been putting off for years. Push further into the realm of a fully struck, gem-quality example with exceptional luster and eye appeal certified at MS65 or above, and the conversation moves past $6,000 into territory that starts to feel less like coin collecting and more like discovering something tucked inside your grandmother's old coat pocket that was always meant to change someone's life. Now take it a step further, because the numismatic market rewards rarity in layers, and each additional factor that makes a coin more unusual, more visually dramatic, more historically documentable, adds another tier to what a motivated buyer will pay. A 1977 D quarter with a confirmed and catalogued wrong planchet error, properly attributed and encapsulated, has brought prices pushing towards $7,500 to $8,000 when the right collector finds it at the right moment. And that number is not an abstraction. That is a down payment on a modest home in some parts of this country, arriving unexpectedly from something that passed through dozens of hands before landing with someone who knew to stop and look. An extraordinarily preserved example, combining a dramatic error with top-tier certification and strong provenance, meaning the coin's history can be traced and documented, has the theoretical ceiling of reaching $9,000 or beyond in the right auction room. And while these outcomes are illustrative and never guaranteed because coin values fluctuate based on market conditions, buyer competition, grade, and authentication, the point is that the distance between ordinary and extraordinary is sometimes just a matter of which side of the loop you are looking from. So before you flip that 1977 D quarter into a parking meter or drop it into a vending machine, understand that the only responsible next step if something about it looks unusual, if the weight is off, if the letters appear doubled, if the rim is inconsistent, if the color of the metal near the edge seems wrong, is to have it evaluated by a professional numismatist or submitted to a third-party grading service like PCGS or NGC. Because no YouTube video, no online forum, and no well-meaning friend with a coin book can give you the certified authentication that transforms a potentially valuable coin into a documented, marketable, life-changing discovery. The treasures in this world rarely announce themselves. They do not come wrapped in velvet or stored in a museum case. They come mixed in with gas station change and forgotten birthday money and coins that have been sitting in a drawer since the Carter administration, waiting for the one person who slows down long enough to notice that something is different. The 1977 D Washington quarter is a coin that rewards patience, punishes assumptions, and proves that ordinary objects can carry extraordinary secrets. And if you think that was surprising, wait until you see what we uncover in the next coin, because what's coming makes this one look like just the beginning. Next coin. This is a 1965 Washington quarter, and if you just glanced at it and moved on, you made the same mistake that millions of Americans have made since the day this coin first entered circulation, because sitting inside this seemingly unremarkable piece of metal is one of the most turbulent, controversial, and collector-significant stories in the entire history of American coinage. A story that begins not with a celebration, but with a crisis, not with pride, but with necessity. And not with silver, but with the painful decision to remove it forever from the coins that had carried it for generations. The year 1965 was not just another year on the calendar for the United States Mint. It was a breaking point, a moment of institutional reckoning when silver hoarding, coin shortages, and the economic pressures of a rapidly changing post-war America forced Congress to pass the Coinage Act of 1965, stripping silver from the dime and quarter entirely, and replacing that historic metal with a copper-nickel-clad composition that the public received with open suspicion and quiet outrage. People dropped these new quarters into their palms, felt something slightly different about the weight, noticed the copper seam visible along the edge when they tilted the coin just right, and many of them simply refused to believe that America had moved on from silver, which is exactly why what happened next inside the minting process created some of the most valuable errors and transitional anomalies in modern American numismatics. What the average person holding a 1965 Washington quarter does not know, and what even many casual collectors miss, is that the mint was operating in a state of controlled chaos during that transition year, running 3 facilities simultaneously while suppressing mint marks on all coins as a deliberate policy decision intended to discourage the date and mint mark hoarding that had contributed to the shortage in the first place. Which means every 1965 quarter you encounter carries no mint mark at all, a feature that was not an accident or an oversight, but a calculated government strategy. And yet that very absence of a mint mark on certain transitional era coins is precisely what makes authentication so layered and so critical. The dies being used in 1965 were sometimes retooled, sometimes carried over, and sometimes mixed in ways that created visual anomalies on the finished coins, doubling in the lettering, repunched design elements, and strike characteristics that don't match what you'd expect from a clean, purpose-built die. And because the mint was under enormous pressure to produce coins as fast as physically possible to flood the market and end the shortage, quality control in 1965 was operating at a level that any modern mint superintendent would find deeply uncomfortable. The result was an entire year's worth of coins that look common, get treated as common, spend decades in circulation being common, and then occasionally surface in an estate sale or a forgotten collection and make someone's hands start shaking. The most electrifying discovery associated with the 1965 Washington quarter is the silver transitional era, and this is the one that changes everything, the one that separates a $2 coin from a life-altering find, because during the transition from 90% silver planchets to the new clad planchets, some silver blanks that were already prepared and sitting in inventory made it through the production line and were struck by 1965 quarter dies, producing coins that look visually identical to a standard 1965 clad quarter, but are made entirely of silver, carrying a composition that was never supposed to exist in that coin for that year, a physical impossibility made possible by the frantic pace of a mint in transition. These silver transitional errors have been authenticated and certified. They are real, they are documented, and they are out there, not in large numbers, not in obvious places, but in change jars and shoeboxes and inherited coin envelopes where nobody thought to weigh them or test them because they looked just like everything else. The silver 1965 quarter weighs 6.25 grams compared to the standard clad version's 5.67 grams, and that difference of slightly over half a gram is invisible to the eye but completely unmistakable on a precise digital scale, which means right now, somewhere in this country, someone has a silver 1965 quarter that they have never weighed, never tested, never thought twice about. And it is sitting there waiting with the patience of something that has already waited 60 years. Beyond the silver transitional era, the 1965 Washington quarter produced a documented range of die errors and striking anomalies that have fueled serious collector interest for decades, and among the most visually compelling is the double die obverse, where the working die was hubbed more than once at slightly inconsistent angles, transferring a ghosted, shadowed second impression of the design elements directly into the metal of every coin that die subsequently produced. On a 1965 quarter with doubled die characteristics, you will see the doubling most clearly in the word Liberty above Washington's portrait, where the letters appear to have a shelf or a secondary outline sitting just slightly offset from the primary letters, and in the date itself, where each digit may show a faint but unmistakable echo of itself in the field of the coin, visible under a loupe or even a strong magnifying glass in good raking light. The portrait of Washington on the obverse, still based on Howdon's 1785 bust and rendered by John Flanagan with a level of artistic detail that was always fighting against the industrial realities of mass production, shows the doubling most dramatically in the hair above the ear and in the definition of the eyebrow. And if you find those characteristics on a 1965 quarter that also passes a weight test, you are holding a coin that belongs in the hands of a professional, not in a parking meter. Pick up your 1965 Washington quarter right now and start at the edge, because the edge of this coin tells a story before you even look at the faces, and what you are looking for is the copper core, that thin band of reddish-orange metal sandwiched between the silvery nickel layers that should be clearly visible when you tilt the coin under a light source and examine the reeded edge straight on. If you do not see that copper core, if the edge appears uniformly silver all the way through with no sandwich layer visible, then you need to put that coin down carefully, write the date and where you found it in a note on your phone, and get it to a scale before you do anything else, because a 1965 quarter with no visible copper seam on its edge and a weight of 6.25 grams is not an ordinary coin and never was. After the edge, go to the strike, turn the coin in your hand and look at the sharpness of the eagle's feathers on the reverse, the definition of the arrows and olive branch the eagle clutches, the crispness of the lettering in quarter dollar along the bottom, and understand that a coin with extraordinarily sharp, fully defined details in every area of the design suggests either exceptional die quality or something about the planchet and strike that sets it apart from the millions of softly struck, heavily circulated examples that define what most people think a 1965 quarter looks like. Now the conversation turns to what these coins have actually done in the marketplace, because the numbers attached to 1965 Washington quarter errors are not speculation or wishful thinking. They are recorded outcomes from auction houses, certified dealer transactions, and private sales between serious collectors who understand exactly what they are acquiring and exactly why it commands what it commands. Notably struck, mint state 1965 quarter with strong luster, minimal contact marks, and exceptional eye appeal, certified by PCGS or NGC at a high grade, has brought outcomes in the range of $5,000 to $7,000 among collectors who specialize in Cladera, Washington quarters. A figure that sounds impossible until you realize how few pristine, uncirculated examples survived 60 years without being spent, dropped, scratched, or cleaned by someone who thought they were being helpful. Step up to a confirmed double die obverse example with clear attributable separation in the lettering and date, certified and catalogued, and auction results have pushed into the $8,000 to $8,200 range, which is the kind of number that makes people think about what else might be in their parents' old collection, what other coins passed through their hands without ceremony that deserved an entirely different kind of attention. The silver transitional era, the authenticated, certified, confirmed silver 1965 Washington quarter, operates in a different financial atmosphere entirely, because it is not just a variety or a die anomaly, but a fundamental compositional impossibility, a coin that should not exist under the laws that governed its own production. And that impossibility carries a premium that reflects genuine scarcity rather than collector preference. With recorded private sale outcomes and auction results for certified examples documented at $35,000, a number that reframes the entire exercise of examining old coins from a hobby into something that feels more like opening a door you didn't know was there. $35,000 is a down payment on a house in most of this country. It is a car paid in cash. It is a year of someone's salary, and it arrived not from an investment portfolio or a lucky lottery ticket, but from a coin that looks, at first glance, exactly like the one you might have dropped into a vending machine last Tuesday without a second thought. For unusual mint anomalies and strong mint-state error combinations, prices in the $8,700 to $9,000 range have been documented, and for one-of-a-kind extraordinary examples with multiple confirmed error characteristics and impeccable certification, the ceiling approaches $10,000, all of which are illustrative of what the market has done rather than promises of what it will do, because coin values move with collector demand, auction competition, and the irreplaceable authority of professional third-party grading. What you do next matters more than anything else in this process, because the single most expensive mistake a person can make after finding a potentially significant 1965 Washington quarter is to clean it, spend it, sell it quickly to someone offering cash without credentials, or convince themselves through internet research alone that they know what they have. The coin market is full of cautionary stories about people who found extraordinary things and walked away with ordinary money because they skipped the step that protects everything else, which is professional authentication through PCGS or NGC, the two most respected independent grading services in numismatics, whose encapsulated holders and certified grades transform a potentially valuable coin into a documented, marketable, defensible asset that the collector community will take seriously. Weigh your coin on a digital scale accurate to the hundredth of a gram, examine the edge for the copper core under good light, study the obverse lettering and date under magnification for any sign of doubling or shadowing, check the rim for evenness and sharpness all the way around the circumference, and if anything about those observations departs from the expected baseline of a standard clad quarter, treat it as though it matters until a professional tells you otherwise, because somewhere out there, in a drawer or a jar or a forgotten envelope tucked into the back of a closet, a silver 1965 Washington quarter is still waiting for the person who finally thought to look. And the next coin we are about to uncover carries a secret so buried, so unexpected, and so staggering in what it has fetched at auction that everything you just learned about looking carefully is going to feel like it was only the beginning. Next coin. This is a 1994 United States Washington quarter, and if you are the kind of person who empties their pockets at the end of the day and drops their change into a bowl without looking, there is a very real possibility that you have already held something significant and sent it right back into circulation without ever knowing what passed through your fingers. Because the 1994 quarter exists in that deceptive middle ground where high mintage creates a false sense of abundance, and that false sense of abundance causes people to stop paying attention at exactly the moment they should be paying the most. The Denver Mint struck approximately 880,034,110 quarters in 1994, a number so enormous it seems to settle the argument before it even begins, seems to guarantee that nothing remarkable could survive inside a production run that vast, and yet that logic has been disproven repeatedly throughout numismatic history. Because the size of a mintage tells you how many ordinary coins were made, and tells you absolutely nothing about the extraordinary ones that slipped through the same machinery carrying characteristics that nobody at the mint intended, authorized, or could have predicted. The mid-1990s were a period of intense production pressure for the Denver facility, a time when demand for circulating coinage was climbing alongside a growing American economy, and that pressure created the conditions: stretched dies, rapid planchet feeding, compressed quality control windows, that have historically generated the kinds of errors and varieties that fuel decades of collector obsession long after the coins themselves have disappeared into everyday commerce. George Washington's portrait on the obverse of the 1994 D quarter carries the same Flanagan design that has anchored the coin since 1932, but what changes from year to year and mint to mint is the quality of the dies used to transfer that design into metal. And by 1994, some of the working dies coming out of Denver were showing characteristics that specialists have spent years cataloging and arguing over in auction previews and numismatic journals. The portrait itself, when struck from a fresh, properly hubbed die, shows extraordinary detail: the individual strands of Washington's powdered hair curling above his ear, the precise definition of his profile from the bridge of his nose to the line of his jaw, the sharp serifs on every letter in God We Trust that runs along the lower left of the obverse, and a 1994 D quarter struck from an early die state with full, uncompromised detail in all of those areas is already a different animal from the softly struck, detail-worn examples that represent the overwhelming majority of what survives from that production run. The reverse eagle, designed with a heraldic formality that carries the full symbolic weight of American governance, shows its own story in the depth of the feathers across the breast shield, the crispness of the talons gripping the arrows and olive branch, and the definition of the stars above the eagle's head. And when all of those elements come together on a single coin with the kind of strike pressure and die freshness that 1994 Denver only occasionally delivered, the result is something that experienced collectors recognize immediately and casual observers walk right past every single time. The era landscape of the 1994 D quarter is where this coin's story becomes genuinely urgent, because among the hundreds of millions struck that year, a documented population of coins emerged from the Denver presses carrying mistakes that were built directly into the dies themselves or introduced through mechanical failures during the striking process. And these errors range from subtle to spectacular in ways that directly and dramatically affect what a coin can command in the collector market. The doubled die obverse is the variety that most 1994 D specialists pursue with the greatest intensity, and it manifests most clearly in the date and in the word liberty, where the hubbing process, the mechanical transfer of the master design into the working die, introduced a slight rotational or lateral shift between successive impressions, leaving a ghosted, doubled outline on the die that then transferred that doubling to every coin the die produced for the remainder of its working life. What makes the 1994 D doubled die particularly compelling to attribute is that the doubling tends to concentrate in specific areas rather than spreading uniformly across the design, which means you can hold 10 1994 D quarters that look identical at arm's length and only discover the doubling on one of them when you bring a loop to the date, and suddenly see that the 4 at the end has a shelf on its inner curve that no properly struck digit should ever have. A tiny mechanical confession hiding in plain sight on a coin that has probably been handled hundreds of times by people who never thought to look. There is another category of 1994 D era that sits in a different register entirely from die varieties, and that is the mechanical error, the off-center strike, the broad strike, the rotated die, each of which represents not a flaw in the die itself, but a failure in the physical choreography of the minting process. A moment when the planchet shifted, or the collar failed, or the dies met at an angle they were never supposed to meet. And the result was a coin that bears the official design of the United States quarter in a configuration that the mint never authorized and never intended to release. An off-center 1994 D quarter, where Washington's portrait is visibly displaced toward one side of the planchet, while the opposite rim either stretches unusually or disappears entirely, is a coin that announces itself the moment you pick it up, a coin so visually wrong that it demands an explanation, and the explanation that it escaped quality control at the Denver Mint and entered circulation as legal tender, is both completely mundane from a historical standpoint and absolutely extraordinary from a collector's standpoint. A rotated die error, where the reverse design sits at a measurable angle relative to the obverse rather than the standard coin alignment, requires a bit more attention to detect, but rewards that attention generously. And experienced collectors checking 1994 D quarters will routinely hold a coin up and rotate it to see whether the eagle on the reverse is standing where it should be or whether something shifted during production that nobody caught before the coin was bagged, shipped, and spent. When you are holding a 1994 D quarter and trying to determine whether you have something ordinary or something that deserves a much more careful conversation, your examination needs to follow a specific physical sequence rather than jumping straight to magnification, because the most important information this coin can give you is tactile and structural before it is ever visual. Start with weight. A genuine 1994 D-clad quarter should register at 5.67 grams on a digital scale capable of measuring to the hundredth of a gram, and any deviation from that baseline in either direction is a signal that something about the planchet or the composition is not standard, with a heavier coin potentially indicating a wrong planchet error where a quarter die struck a blank intended for a different denomination or a foreign coin entirely. Move to the edge and examine it in direct light for the copper core that should be clearly visible as a reddish-orange seam between the two silvery nickel outer layers, because a coin without that visible sandwich construction, or a coin where the edge looks wrong in any way, too thick, too thin, inconsistently reeded, or showing metal flow that suggests a broad strike, is telling you something about how it was made that the face of the coin alone cannot communicate. Finally, go to the rim itself and trace it around the full circumference of the coin, because an even, sharp, consistently raised rim all the way around is the signature of a properly struck coin in a properly seated collar, and any area where the rim flattens, widens, or disappears is a physical record of something going wrong at the moment of striking that may have produced a coin far outside the bounds of what the Denver Mint was trying to make that day. Now the numbers enter the conversation, and they enter it the way significant numbers always do, quietly at first, then with increasing force as the context builds around them, because the documented collector outcomes for notable 1994 D Washington quarter errors are not the product of speculation or inflated asking prices, but of actual transactions between informed buyers and sellers who understood precisely what changed hands and why it commanded what it commanded. A clearly attributed double die obverse on a 1994 D quarter in circulated but problem-free condition, properly identified and submitted for third-party certification, has produced documented sale outcomes in the range of $3,000 to $6,000 depending on the clarity of the doubling, the grade assigned by the certification service, and the competitive appetite of the collector pool at the moment of sale. And that range alone should be enough to make anyone reconsider how carefully they look at their change. Move into higher grade territory, a mint state 1994 D with a confirmed variety attribution and original luster intact, the kind of coin that somehow avoided 60 years of pockets and cash registers and coin counters and survived with its surfaces essentially unmarked, and the outcomes documented in the collector market climb towards $7,000, a figure that arrives not from rarity alone, but from the intersection of rarity and condition. Two variables that almost never align perfectly and command a premium every time they do. The errors with the most dramatic physical presence command the most dramatic prices, and in the 1994 D quarter series, that means the confirmed mechanical errors, the significant off-centers, the wrong planchet strikes, the coins where something went so fundamentally wrong during production that the coin itself became a document of that failure, have generated outcomes that push the conversation into genuinely life-changing territory. Strong off-center 1994 D quarter, one where the design is displaced by 30% or more while the date remains visible, because a fully off-center coin with no visible date is worth dramatically less than one where you can still confirm what it is and where it came from, has brought documented results of $8,000, and in exceptional cases $8,600 when the strike is dramatic, the surfaces are clean, and the certification is unimpeachable. A confirmed wrong planchet error on a 1994 D, where the Denver dies struck a blank that had no business being in that press, represents the kind of numismatic accident that produces outcomes documented at $9,000 for verified examples, and for the rarest misstrikes, coins combining multiple error characteristics in a single piece, each one individually significant and collectively extraordinary. Private collector transactions have been recorded approaching $11,000, amounts that are presented here as documented market history rather than promises, because the coin market rewards the verified, the certified, and the patiently authenticated, never the rushed, the unchecked, or the impulsively sold. The difference between finding $11,000 and finding nothing is almost always the same thing. It is the decision to slow down before the decision to act, to examine before you spend, to submit before you sell, to treat the possibility of something extraordinary with the seriousness it deserves rather than the casual dismissal that costs people life-changing discoveries every single year in this country. If your 1994 D quarter passes the weight test and the edge test, and you find something under magnification that looks like doubling in the date or the lettering, the only responsible path forward is submission to PCGS or NGC, the two grading services whose encapsulated holders and population reports are the language that the serious collector market speaks fluently. Because a coin in a plastic flip with a handwritten note is a conversation starter, and a coin in a certified holder with a grade and an attribution is a transaction, and that difference in presentation reflects a difference in credibility that translates directly into the amount of money a buyer is willing to commit. 1994 D Washington quarter has been circulating for over 30 years, passing through millions of hands, riding in billions of pockets, sitting in countless change jars in kitchens and laundry rooms and office desks across America, and somewhere in all of that ordinary movement, the extraordinary examples are still out there, still unweighed, still unexamined, still waiting, and the next coin coming up in this series carries a story so unexpected, a value so documented, and a hiding place so unassuming that everything you have learned about looking carefully is about to become more important than ever. Next coin. This is a 1990 P Washington quarter, and the P mint mark pressed just above the date on the obverse of this coin is the first detail that separates it from everything else in its era, because the Philadelphia Mint did not place its mint mark on quarters at all until 1980, making every P mint quarter from that decade, and into the 1990s, part of a relatively short mint mark tradition that collectors track with a specificity that casual observers never anticipate. The Philadelphia Mint in 1990 was operating inside a production environment that looked efficient on paper and was considerably more complicated in practice, striking 613,792,000 quarters that year, a number that floods the imagination with images of sameness, of identical coins rolling off identical presses in an endless mechanical rhythm, and yet within that rhythm. As has been proven time and again across American numismatic history, the machinery occasionally stumbled, the dies occasionally misbehaved, and the planchets occasionally arrived from sources they were never supposed to arrive from. And when those things happened in 1990 at Philadelphia, the resulting coins entered circulation looking exactly like everything else, while carrying secrets that the naked eye was never designed to catch. What makes the 1990 P quarter particularly interesting to the collector community is not just the errors that have been documented on it, but the context of the era in which it was made. The tail end of a decade defined by economic optimism and institutional confidence, a period when the Mint's internal culture was not asking hard questions about what was slipping through. And that institutional comfort created the gaps through which remarkable coins quietly escaped into the world. The Philadelphia Mint in 1990 was working with dies that carried the Washington obverse portrait in a form that had been refined and adjusted multiple times since the original Flanagan design debuted in 1932, and by the time those dies were being cut and deployed for the 1990 production run, the process of hubbing, transferring the master design into working dies through a hydraulic press, had enough variables built into it that subtle inconsistencies between die pairs were not only possible, but essentially inevitable across a production run of 600 million coins. The obverse portrait of Washington, as rendered on 1990p quarters, shows his profile facing right with the legend Liberty arcing above, "In God We Trust," positioned to the left, and the date, 1990, sitting below the portrait with the P mint mark tucked just above it. And on a coin struck from a fresh early state die, each of those elements carries a sharpness and three-dimensional presence that is genuinely striking. Washington's hair rendered with individual curl definition, the lettering with clean, uncompromised serifs, the mint mark itself punched with enough authority that it reads as a declaration rather than an afterthought. The reverse carries the heraldic eagle design that had by 1990 become so familiar to the American public that most people could not have described it in detail if asked, which is precisely the kind of invisibility that allows important differences in strike quality, die condition, and design anomalies to hide in plain sight on coins that people handle dozens of times before spending without a second thought. Among the errors documented on 1990p Washington quarters, the one that commands the most sustained collector attention is the double die obverse, and understanding what that error actually represents mechanically is important before understanding why it matters financially, because the double die is not a trick of lighting or a product of wear. It is a permanent feature built into the working die itself during the hubbing process. When the die received successive impressions from the master hub at slightly inconsistent angles or positions, and those misaligned impressions merged into a single die face that carried the ghost of both strikes simultaneously. On a 1990p quarter with a confirmed double die obverse, the evidence concentrates most dramatically in the date, where the numerals, 1990, show a secondary outline displaced slightly from the primary digits, not a smear, not a scratch, not a grease-filled die artifact, but a clean, defined second impression sitting in a fixed position relative to the first, the same on every coin that die ever produced. The word Liberty, above Washington's portrait, is the second focal point, where the doubling appears in the letter serifs, and particularly in the crossbar of the E, and the curves of the B, details so small that they disappear at arm's length and reveal themselves fully only under 10-power loop held steady in good directional light, which is why so many of these coins have been spent, saved casually, and passed along without anyone ever discovering what the die was confessing in the lettering. The Philadelphia Mint's 1990 production run also generated a category of errors that go beyond die anomalies into the realm of mechanical failure, and these striking errors, the off-centers, the broad strikes, the coins where the collar that normally contains the planchet during striking either failed or was misaligned, produced 1990p quarters that carry the full authority of United States coinage in a physical form that the Mint never sanctioned and never intended to release. A broad strike occurs when a planchet is struck outside the retaining collar, allowing the metal to spread laterally under the impact of the dies without the collar's constraint, producing a coin that is thinner than normal, wider than normal, with a rim that either disappears entirely or becomes an irregular, flowing boundary rather than the sharp defined edge of a properly struck coin, and the 1990p broad strike quarters that have been certified carry that distinctive flattened spread appearance that makes them immediately recognizable to anyone who has studied minting errors, while remaining completely mysterious to anyone who hasn't. The off-center strikes from this issue, where the planchet fed into the striking chamber misaligned so that the dies contacted only a portion of the blank, produced coins where Washington's portrait appears to be sliding off one edge of the coin while blank, unstruck metal occupies the opposite side, and the collector market's appetite for these errors is directly proportional to the percentage of off-centering, the more dramatic the displacement, and crucially, The more clearly the date remains visible despite that displacement, the more the coin commands when it reaches the right buyer. Before you reach for a loop or a scale, there is a physical examination sequence for the 1990p quarter that should always begin with the coin's edge, because the edge communicates compositional information that neither face of the coin can provide on its own, and what you are looking for is the three-layer sandwich construction, the copper core flanked by two cupronickel outer layers. That should be clearly visible as a reddish-brown seam running between two silvery bands when you tilt the coin under a light source and examine the reeded edge straight on. 1990p quarter that shows that copper core clearly is confirming its standard clad composition, but a coin whose edge appears uniformly metallic without the sandwich construction, or whose edge shows unusual metal flow, irregular reading, or thickness inconsistent with a properly struck clad planchet, is telling you something about its composition or its striking history that demands further investigation before you make any decisions about what it is or what it is worth. After the edge, place the coin on a precise digital scale, because the standard 1990p clad quarter weighs 5.67 grams, and deviations above or below that number in a coin that otherwise appears genuine are among the most important diagnostic signals in all of error coin examination. A coin heavier than expected raises questions about its planchet origin, and a coin lighter than expected raises questions about whether a clad layer separated during or after striking. Both of which are conditions that have produced verified, certified, high-value error coins from Philadelphia's 1990 production run. Here is where the documented market outcomes for the 1990p Washington quarter begin to reframe the entire conversation, because the prices that certified examples of this coin's notable varieties and errors have achieved in auction rooms and private collector transactions are not the product of enthusiasm or hope. They are recorded numbers attached to specific coins with specific certifications and specific attributions. And they tell a story about what the market genuinely believes these coins are worth when the evidence is properly assembled and presented. A minor double die obverse on a 1990p quarter in a circulated but problem-free grade, certified by a recognized third-party grading service and attributed to a known variety, has produced documented sale outcomes ranging from $900 to $2,000, which is already a return on a coin with a face value of 25 cents that most people would find difficult to process emotionally. Because there is something specifically disorienting about learning that an object you have been treating as insignificant has been selling for the equivalent of several months of car insurance payments among people who know what they are looking at. A more dramatic doubling with clear separation visible across multiple design elements, attributed and certified at a higher grade with original mint luster intact, has produced outcomes documented at $3,000 and a gem mint state example of the same variety, a coin that somehow survived from 1990 to the present without a single meaningful mark on its surfaces, has reached $3,500 in transactions where the buyer understood that the combination of variety attribution and pristine preservation almost never happens and paid accordingly. The mechanical errors from the 1990p issue operate in a higher register financially because they are not varieties that require attribution knowledge to appreciate. They are visually self-evident coins that announce their own extraordinariness the moment they are removed from a holder, and that visual immediacy drives competitive bidding in ways that subtle die varieties sometimes cannot. A confirmed broad strike on a 1990p quarter, certified and problem-free, has generated documented outcomes at $5,000 for strong examples, while off-center strikes with dramatic displacement and a fully visible date, the combination that every error coin specialist is hunting, have been recorded at $6,000 in private sales between collectors who recognized that the specific combination of displacement percentage, date visibility, and surface preservation they were looking at was not something likely to cross their desk again soon. For the rarest mechanical errors on this issue, coins where multiple error characteristics compound into a single piece that represents a genuinely unique production accident, the documented ceiling climbs to $6,500 for extraordinary single characteristic examples and reaches $9,000 for the kind of one-of-a-kind minting accident that comes to auction once, gets written about in numismatic publications, and then disappears into a private collection for a generation, all of which are presented here as documented market history, because the coin market is not a guarantee machine, it is a discovery machine, and it rewards the prepared, the patient, and the properly authenticated. What you do with this information right now, in the next few minutes after this video ends, will determine whether you become one of the people who found something extraordinary or one of the people who almost did, and the distance between those two outcomes is not talent or luck. It is simply whether you go look. Pull out every 1990p quarter you can find, run the edge examination, run the weight test, bring a loop to the date and the lettering, check the strike alignment by rotating the coin between obverse and reverse to confirm the eagle sits where it should. And if anything about what you see or feel departs from what a standard, unremarkable clad quarter should be, treat that coin with the seriousness it may deserve and submit it to PCGS or NGC before you make any other decision, because the certification that transforms a potentially valuable coin into a documented, marketable, credible asset is not an expense. It is the only step that makes everything else count. The rare coins in this world do not live in museums and bank vaults. They live in change jars and desk drawers and the bottom of old purses in closets that haven't been opened since the 1990s, and the only thing standing between those coins and the people who would pay real money for them is the decision to look carefully instead of moving on quickly. If this video changed the way you see the change in your pocket, subscribe right now, because every coin coming in this series carries a story just as layered, just as unexpected, and just as potentially valuable as the one you just heard, and the next one might already be sitting in your hand.